evening, everybody. Can we get this show on the road, please? I'm Ilse Feinauer, chair of this evening's program and also main organizer of, if you don't know it by now. Thank you so much. President of the European Society for Translation Studies, Professor Arndt Lucas Jacobsen, all EST executive board members, the Stellenbosch University Rector Research, Professor Eugene Klute, the Dean, Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, Professor Anthony Leysens, Chair of the Department of Afrikaans and Dutch, Professor Andries Versasi, fellow translation, interpreting studies scholars, colleagues, students, and friends. I would like to welcome you all to Stellenbosch, the second oldest formal town in South Africa, and to Stellenbosch University, one of the oldest universities in South Africa. Now, you might ask yourselves why the European Society for Translation Studies Congress takes place in Stellenbosch. Now, let me tell you how it has happened. 10 years ago, in September 29, exactly 10 years ago, Professor Christiane Noord paid an academic visit to Stellenbosch. And she then told me it would make a wonderful venue for an EST Congress. Now, after years of thinking about this and consulting with other EST board members and presidents, we have started preparing our bid in 2015, and one thing led to another. We now realize that Christiane Noord really wanted to return to Stellenbosch since she was the very first person to register for this, for this Congress. Now, luckily, she was not the only person to register, since we have more than 200 delegates from 46 countries who will read more than 200 papers, either as part of one of the 21 panels, as freestanding paper or poster, all linked to the theme of the Congress, Living Translation, People, Processes, and Products. Now, the theme speaks to the latest research trends in translation studies, namely deep or thick sociological approaches, used to describe lived realities in social contexts. Living translation relates to enactments of reality more so than reflections or reports on reality. In Africa in particular, translation is intrinsically linked with its environment. Translation in all its variety is not only the object of an academic discipline, it is a fact of life. The theme therefore ties the discipline of translation studies to Africa as context. Then, also a special word of welcome to all our 4 keynote speakers with Guy Midgley and Kobus Maree, respectively as opening and closing speakers. Their presentations will frame the Congress, both dealing with complexity, change, and emerging meaning, and both of them are moving beyond the term translation as most of us know and study it. We are also privileged to have Paul Bandia, dealing with power and minority language cultures, and Claudia Angelelli, exploring translation and interpreting studies crossing interdisciplinary boundaries. Now, none of this could have happened without sponsors, and we want to thank the following: Stellenbosch University, especially the Research Division, the Language Center of Stellenbosch University. The acronym TAO stands for Trust vir Afrikaanse Onderwys, Trust for Afrikaans Teaching, Folio Online Language Service Provider, Penguin and Random House Publishers, Van Skyke Publishers and Bookshop, and Welmoed and Kaapzig Wineries for the wines you've had tonight and which you might continue having afterwards. Then we have a few exhibitors who have traveled far and paid lots of money to get their books here on time. And they are Brol, John Benjamins, Routledge, and the South African Translators Institute is also welcomed as exhibitor. Now, even with support from sponsors, the Congress would still not have been possible without committed individuals. First of all, I want to thank the Scientific Committee, chaired by Luc van Doorslaer, for all their reading of abstracts, writing of comments, and decisions that they had to motivate. But most importantly is the organizing team, led by the very efficient Ansu Kolditz, who is sitting here in the corner of Millennium Conference and Event Management. And then the members of the local organizing committee, and I would like them to stand up and turn around so that you could all see whom to target with your inquiries. First of all, L.B. Ardendorf. Lelani de Roubaix. Rufus Gous. Harold Lesch. Amanda Lorenz. And Marius Swart. You see, he literally has my back. Now, if you do not remember what they look like, just look out for our team of student assistants in there. I've had written here mint green T-shirts, but I've now seen today it's a very bright lime green T-shirt. Then I would also like to mention Helle Dam from Aarhus, Denmark, as the previous Congress organizer, who has given us good advice throughout. And Liana Roos. So Helle Dam and Liana Roos, our office manager of the Department of Afrikaans and Dutch, who has helped the organizing committee tremendously throughout. Now, for the official opening of this Congress, I would like to invite the Vice Rector Research, Professor Eugene Klutte, to join me, and he will now handle the official opening. And I just want to mention, while he's making his way up the stage, that his division, Research Development, was the most generous in supporting the Congress financially.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Feinauer. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues. A warm welcome to Stellenbosch University. It's great to see so many of you here attending the European Society for Translation Studies, the 9th Triennial Congress. Special word of welcome also to the President, Professor Jacobsen. We're happy to have you here, and of course the conference organizers, and the lead there with Professor Feinauer. All of you that have organized the conference will know that this is not an easy thing to do. You have traveled a long way from 46 odd different countries, and they say a journey is not a journey without a destination. And Stellenbosch is your destination. And it's not a closed destination. For many of you, you had to travel very far, and thank you for being here and visiting us here in this beautiful little town. Also, Professor Doorslaer, the chair of the scientific committee, and colleagues that I know very well who will be speaking to you here. I must say, Professor Midgley, I was actually really surprised to see you on the agenda here. And being one of the keynote speakers, he's multi-talented, so in that way it doesn't surprise me. But to come to a translation conference and be the keynote speaker, that's quite something. Now, we value language at this university very much so, and we also, promote multilingualism from a whole variety of different reasons. First of all, we have 11 official languages in South Africa. We have at this university 2 that we have as official languages, Afrikaans and English. Now, what we've learned as you work with language policies and as you move forward, that language is a very emotional thing. It is a way that people identify themselves with, they associate themselves with particular cultures. And so it is important to promote also the other 11 languages. So Afrikaans, English, and isiXhosa is the language that is also spoken here in the Western Cape, and we try to promote that and build that as an academic language, very much so. There's another reason that I personally like different languages. I'm also responsible for innovation at this university, over and above the research. Now, innovation happens when you get people with different cultures and languages to sit around the same table. This was recognized already many, many years ago by the De Mickey family, who deliberately in Venice organized meetings around a table where people could have coffee and wine and so forth with different backgrounds, different cultures, different languages. And what they then observed is that when you have people get together from such a diversity of different backgrounds, you create intersections. And it's at these intersections which new ideas are in fact born that did not exist before. So from an innovation point of view, language is extremely important, and translation is becoming, and has always been, very important. And I noticed, that you also talk about people, and you talk about process, and you talk about products. And I was asking myself, what products? What are the processes? The people I understand. The process is more difficult. The product's a little bit more difficult. But if we look at what is happening at the moment, worldwide, in terms of big data, and how big data and machine learning and artificial intelligence is in fact impacting on the world, I think what you have to do is very relevant at the moment. And I wish I could attend some of these sessions looking at the program to also educate myself a little bit more about the processes and products that you will be talking about during this week. And we look at some of the technological innovations happening in translation. About 5-6 years ago, we had a big debate here, and we were going through lots of debates around language. And at the time, I made the comment that perhaps we are worrying too much about the language and the different languages. Perhaps technology one day will just take care of this, where you would sit in a lecture theater anywhere in the world and you would choose the language you would like to hear the lecture. So perhaps that's going to happen. It does not take into consideration, however, the context and the humor and many other things. So it's a very technical thing, and I still need to be convinced that that will actually replace translation as we know it. But I'm sure it's something that you will debate, things you think about, and so on. So in conclusion, just perhaps on a lighter note, the story about a beautiful conference like this, lots of people starting on a Monday, continuing all the way to a Thursday, and it's about the last speaker on Thursday afternoon at 4 o'clock. So at this particular conference, it was the speaker, it was the chair of the session, and there was one other person left in the audience. Let's hope this does not happen at this meeting. But anyway, so after the introduction, the speaker thanks the chair for the introduction, and also thanks the person that is still in the audience. So the person in the audience puts up his hand, he says, "No need to thank me, I am the last speaker." So I really hope that, and this is a nice town, there is a lot to do here, lots of nice places to eat and to entertain yourself. Enjoy that, enjoy the fruits of our vineyards also responsibly. But most of all, enjoy your time here, enjoy the networking, enjoy the presentations. You are more than welcome here, and with this I officially open this conference, and thank you for listening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Klute. I believe some of you have started to enjoy the fruits of the vine already. I would now like to invite Professor Arndtlijke Jacobsen to join me on stage. As most of you know, he is the current president of the EST, and as has become customary throughout the years, the president always have his presidential introductory word at the start of the conference, at the Congress. Thank you, Professor Jacobsen.
Thank you very much, Ilse. Good evening, everybody, distinguished representatives from the university, and dear members of the EST, and welcome also all the non-members. You can always take out membership later this evening. The event that we have all been looking forward to for 3 years now is this EST 2019 Congress here at Stellenbosch. And ever since we knew that Stellenbosch was the winner 3 years ago. So as president of EST, it's my great pleasure to thank the organizers for the immense effort that I know they have put into preparing all of this. So we want to thank the organizers. We want to thank the university also for giving us the use of their fantastic facilities. This is the first time, as we've heard, that an EST Congress is held outside Europe. It was the decision of the previous EST board, and as I was not involved in making the decision, I can say with perfect impartiality that I think it was an important and a right decision, because translation should know no borders. And in the European Society for Translation Studies, we don't want only to support activities in Europe. We don't want to be confined to, narrowly confined geographically to Europe. It was still, I think, a somewhat daring decision, and I don't know how many glasses of pinotage Christiane Nord had been drinking when she suggested that this would be a good location. But then I think, as I said, that this was a very good decision. I had my concerns, I have to say, because we're invited now always to think of the amount of CO2 that long-haul flights emit, and we're even invited to feel flight shame. Have you come across the expression? So I was concerned, but seeing how many panels were proposed, how many papers and how many posters were announced, and seeing so many people here right now put my concern to shame. And yesterday I was on an all-day trip sampling some of the produce from the wineries around here, and I have to say, and you have all had a chance now to sample the quality of the produce that is produced there. It was a very thrilling event. It was slightly intoxicating in the end, I have to admit. But that's how I see what we are going. I mean, I'm sure we're going to have a very orderly Congress. But metaphorically, it's going to be no less than bacchanalian, I think. So I really look forward to that. I hope you are all looking forward to it very much. Yeah, you told me that I couldn't be saying all of what I was planning to say. So let me get to the end. The study of translation and interpreting obviously works across disciplines and gets into every corner, gets into every other discipline. It is everywhere, it is in all of us, and we are all, in a sense, translators. So that and many other topics will be covered. It at once something that we all know about. It's very simple, and it's one of the most complex phenomena, I think, also to get a good grasp of. But that is not for me to talk about now. We will look forward to, you said about 200, I think it's closer to 300 presentations and talks and posters and all of that over the next couple of days. And of course, in being members of the world of translation and interpreting studies, we think this is the most important thing that we can do in our lives, and that we are creating a better world as a result of that. So I would like just in the end to restate my deep appreciation of the preparation that has been done here, and I hope for everyone that we will have a fantastic and superb Congress. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Jacobsen. I actually did not rule and regulate him too much. Sorry about that, Arndt. We will now have a short breather in the form of entertainment by the Frank Peterson Music Center Choir. It's quite a long name, conducted by Arno Jones. Now, let me give you some background on the choir. The Frank Peterson Music Center is situated in our neighboring wine town, Parel. And this music center was established to give disadvantaged communities access to quality music education. The center strives towards the musical development of both children and adults, to provide infrastructure and support to its surrounding communities, and to find and develop talent and potential. The Frank Peterson Music Center Choir is one of the standing instruments of the center, and is a reflection of the beauty and diversity to its home, the center. The choir took part in the 2018 World Choir Games, where they received critical acclaim, and they are now working towards a future of choral excellence. The conductor, Arno Jones, is an alumnus of this university's conservatoire, where he studied accompaniment and voice. He accompanies various musicians worldwide, and currently he is continuing his studies in voice at Stellenbosch University. The choir will perform 4 short pieces this evening. The first is a classical Italian piece, Il Bianco e Dolce Cigno. After this, they will perform 1 piece in each of South Africa's 3 largest languages. Lisa's Klavier, translated Lisa's Piano in Afrikaans, a Zulu wedding celebration song where the young Zulu bride tells her mother that she has found a man, and finally a prayer in Xhosa to bid all of us a good conference and a great stay in South Africa. So I give you the Frank Peterson Music Center Choir.
As die son sak, speel sy die mooiste
Agree with me, this was very moving. And I want to thank the choir again. And if you haven't noticed him, Mario Swart is one of the choir members. And his wife was on the piano keyboard. Now, we have now come to the final item on tonight's program, namely our first keynote speaker for EST 2019, Professor Guy Midgley, from the Department of Botany and Zoology at Stellenbosch University. Now, he told me earlier tonight he doesn't want to sit there while I announce him because he would feel like an actor in a play. They always say actors should not act with children or animals, and sorry for having you after the choir, since you have a hard act to follow, but I think this is the highlight of the evening. Now, Professor Klutter was surprised to find him on the program. He's obviously not working in translation studies. But his choice as keynote was brought about by Michael Cronin's 2017 work, Eco-Translation, Translation and Ecology in the Age of the Anthropocene. Now, forgive me, it's a longish bio that I'm going to read to you because I could have given you much more. Professor Midgley is a plant physiologist and ecologist working at the interface between global change biology, conservation science, and national as well as international environmental climate policies. As creative thinker and gifted communicator, he combines his deep and fundamental understanding of the ecophysiology of plants and has a unique ability to visualize and contextualize the consequences of differences in the ecophysiological traits for entire ecological systems and geographic regions. As leader in global change science and policy and being an outstanding contributor to larger research teams, he has had exposure to problems spanning the fundamentals of plant ecophysiology to applied questions in conservation biology and global change biology. He was nominated by his peers to represent the field of global change biology and the South African region in the international global change science and policy arena. He has led and contributed to several policy-related government reports and collaborated internationally on global change research themes in Chile, Australia, the USA, the UK, Germany, France, Botswana, and Namibia. Thomson Reuters listed him as a highly cited researcher, one of only 6 in South Africa. He has an exceptional publication record and has authored or co-authored more than 160 scientific and popular publications. He recently received the prestigious Humboldt Research Award from the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation in Germany. The title of his talk tonight is, as you can see, The Message in the Noise, Reflections on Complexity in Communicating Science. Now, he said he's going, and that is it. It's not so long after all, I think. I don't want to take up any more of his time, but he'll be about 30-35 minutes. He will engage you while talking, but he will also take questions afterwards. And he'll handle his own questions, he told me. But I will be on the stage again, and that will be very short to give you a very good announcement, I hope. So don't run away after he has said goodbye. Professor Midgley?
Thanks. Can you switch these lights off? Can I turn them down? Oh, that's perfect. Good evening. Yeah, it is a tough act to follow. I sang in a choir myself many years ago, so that was thoroughly enjoyable. Thanks very much. Thanks, Ilse, for inviting me to speak to this audience. It's given me a real chance to talk about a couple of things I've never really talked about before. So going through the program, some of the background material you gave me was exceptionally interesting. So I hope I can get some hooks to interest you about global change science and how difficult it is to communicate it. I want to immediately launch into a link with translation studies, though, following on Eugene's introduction, because I came to Stellenbosch University. I studied here in the late 1970s. At that time, it was a very Afrikaans university, and I arrived here as a very English boy, young man, and all the lectures were given in Afrikaans, and I would have to translate while the lecturer was speaking. So I very quickly learned how to supply my own translation services. But the thing about Afrikaans is that very often the verb, it comes at the end of the sentence. So I would have to leave a space in the sentence that I was translating and come back and fill it in. Oh, it's not quite long enough. So if Eugene's dream of this future lecture theatre comes true, my advice is to make sure that the sentences are delayed by one sentence at least. I should patent that. After university, I became an ecologist, and my first exposure to ecological science was in the deserts of southern Africa. In those days, we were still towards the tail end of apartheid, the early 80s. And we didn't have a lot of connection with the outside world, quite rightly. And after several years working in desert ecology towards the late 1980s and early 90s, it became clear that we were moving towards a transition in this country, going back into the international world, and I became extremely interested in climate change as an issue to study. I thought that would be a good issue to launch into what was a very national study into something really international and global. And desert ecology is a good introduction to climate change, as I'm sure you can imagine. But after many years of working with the National Biodiversity Institute in the science of climate change, I got involved in policy and into the world of political negotiation with science as a base. And there I became exposed to the real importance of language, the value of language, and the value of terminology in breaking deadlock. And I'll just give you one example. Because in climate science or climate policy, you're trying to find a way forward which suits a multiplicity of interests. Multiple countries have multiple interests. Some are more reliant on fossil energy. Some people like flying more than others. Some nations depend more on water, others on food production. And so you end up in a very difficult church where multiple interests are competing to come up with conclusions and a way forward. But the phrase that I remember particularly well, and it's still current today, that really helped to break a deadlock in the 90s was a marvelous phrase, and it is the concept of common but differentiated responsibility. You can see how clever that phrase is. We have a responsibility that's common, but it's differentiated. So everybody can go their own way, but we're all interested in the same thing. And it came up. A policymaker came up with that phrase to move forward. And of course, now it's translated as CBDR, as so often occurs in these negotiations. A new language develops. So everybody knows what CBDR means. It's common but differentiated responsibility. Anyway, so that's a little introduction to the background of some background in climate change, global change science. But I want to, well, I'm hopefully going to interest you, and I want to talk about two concepts from climate change. Well, one concept from climate change science, another concept is entirely different, but it's a concept that affects us in science. So I want to talk about the chaos paradox, and I'm not sure how many of you have been exposed to the idea of deterministic chaos, which lies at the heart of our inability to predict climate, to predict the weather. I talk about it because I feel that we've moved into a world where we're struggling with language. We need to communicate to the world these very, very complicated issues. But we don't have the language to do so. So scientists come up with these terms. And this is one of them, chaos. And I'm sure to most of you, chaos means disorder, disorganization. But it's used it doesn't mean that at all. So when this is translated, it may make no sense to people. The concept and the word that scientists have come up with and used. So it just confuses everybody. This is a real problem that we have. And the second concept I want to share with you, which is something I've never talked about before, which is based on this incredible image that is not far from here, a few hours' drive away from where we are today. And it's an image drawn by the San culture, late Stone Age culture. And I want to talk about the expectation bias. How do we overcome an expectation bias, which affects us, affects the way that we view the world? And I'm going to see if you can see the message in this image, because there's a message staring you right in the face. But because of your expectation bias, I very much doubt that any of you will see it. But let's see. I'll set that towards the end of the talk. Okay. So those are the two things I want to talk about. But let me start by just a little bit of background on climate change and the importance and the value of communicating climate messages. Those of you who have any connection to the news will recognize the storm. This is this is Dorian, which laid waste to the Bahamas in the last couple of days. And it was truly an unprecedented storm in the Grand Bahamas. It looks like it's killed a lot of people. But what's interesting about this image is the science behind the prediction of the storm, and the communication of that science, and how it evolved over the week or so that the storm held the attention of the world. Halfway through that period, hovering over the Grand Bahamas for almost 2 days, and it illustrates the inherent difficulty of communicating to people the risk of a storm like this. So you'll see that the track follows a slightly wiggly route. And as the storm progressed across the Pacific, across the Atlantic and headed up towards Florida, it was initially projected to move across the peninsula of Florida and cause major damage. It was in fact predicted to hover over Florida. You'll note it did just miss Alabama. Actually, I meant to ask, are there any Americans in the audience? There are. Okay, I'll temper some of my comments in that case. It's one of the 46 countries. We'll see. Indeed. But and this illustrates the difficulty of making these projections and predictions. During the course of the storm, those of you who followed it will know that the US flew flights through the storm regularly in a crisscross pattern, over and over again, collecting data. And you may ask why. Why did they have to do that? And the reason is they keep on having to update the prediction because the model keeps on diverging from reality. So they keep on flying these missions to collect more data, put them back into the model, and nudge the model back into line. So it tells us that our models, they're pretty good, but they drift away from reality over time. And this is actually the basis of this issue of deterministic chaos. Climate or weather is inherently unpredictable. There is a limit to what we can predict. And it lies in a very, very interesting phenomenon, a very interesting characteristic of climate, which I'll tell you about. And hope that you can help me in the ways in which we can translate this and communicate it to the rest of the world, because we don't, I think we struggle as scientists with the language of this. There are other messages which we need to communicate and which also are associated with uncertainty. This is Greenland, also interestingly in the news relating to the US recently. Who's seen the Conan O'Brien videos on YouTube? Strongly recommended. He visited there recently, making an offer on behalf of he who shall remain nameless. But this is joking aside, this is a very important image, because if all the ice on Greenland were to melt, it would raise sea level by 7 meters, more than 20 feet. Who knows the rate of sea level rise? How much has the sea level risen since 1990? Does anybody have an idea of how your world is changing? Very good, 8 centimeters. Excellent. Top of the class. You should be president. Okay. But so, yeah, Greenland's melting fast. And we have a graph on the right-hand side showing the melt percentage in 2019. It looks like it's really a lot higher than the long-term average, which is the 1981 to 2010 median. So, but we also know that 2012 was worse than this. So how do we communicate the urgency of these things with all the uncertainty, all the noise? There's a lot of noise in this figure. This is all uncertainty here. Is this really outside of the noise? Is there a message here? And how do we as scientists communicate this and try to enhance the urgency of addressing this issue? Here's an example from closer to home. This is a very significant fire that happened in the Western Cape, I think about a year ago. And we had, at the tail end of a very long drought, an extremely heavy wind event, very dry air, combined with people who start fires, and this fire got going. And it was an unprecedented fire at that time. But it's very, very complicated because there's a climate signal in this, but there's also a human signal. And the human signal is that we planted these trees in an area which doesn't normally have trees like this. These are pines from Europe and California. They don't belong here. This should be a shrubland. So this fire, once it got going, really destroyed a lot of property. Killed a few people. But it's more than a climate message. This is a complicated message. There's complexity here. And we need to find ways. We're trying to find ways of illustrating and indicating the complexity of what we face and trying to communicate it And it's a really important issue that we have to deal with. So we've dumped ourselves in a load of complexity as a species. We're now more than 50% urban. Our cities are highly complex. We have highly interdependent systems. We have entirely changed the landscape. We've altered the seascape. We've made ourselves incredibly vulnerable. So we now live in a system which is extremely vulnerable to change, but also has resilience. And we're trying to communicate and understand that. And it's not proving an easy job. Our vulnerability lies in this set of graphs here, which show a period that's now called the Great Acceleration, where we literally have been through a phase shift in the way that we exist as a species. So prior to the 1940s, 1950s, we lived a completely different life. We have increased our wealth, some of us. We've increased our population. We have increased our energy use. This has fueled this. We've relying more on fertilizer, much more. Well, maybe that's going to stop now that we just have the internet. Our water use has gone up. So we've created a system which is very complex, very vulnerable to change, and we're barreling towards this change at an extremely high rate. And it's proving exceptionally difficult to communicate this. We seem to be sleepwalking into this change. And in fact, in some parts of the world, there are groups actively denying that we are walking into this crisis. And it's incredible to me that the message cannot get through. And I don't know why. But clearly, we need to find ways. And hopefully, people that do the work that you do can help us to come up with new ways of communicating the urgency and the difficulties that we're moving into. This is a great graph illustrating complexity, but it's a conceptualization by a bunch of scientists, which is going to confuse everybody. But it illustrates, somebody's tried to put together all these linkages and how our world operates. More than this complexity of linkages, we have a further thing going on. And that is that we're starting to predict things and project. And the predictions that we make are now themselves feeding back on our on the present day. So in anticipation of something that we predict, we have a feedback which is either changing or not changing the way that we respond. So I would suggest we call this a hypercomplexity. It's a system that is both inherently complex, but is also responding to its own projections of its future self. It's how do we don't have the language to deal with this, and even our models are inadequate. And this this contamination by prediction is having very real impacts on our lives. Here's one example, I think, of contamination by prediction. I followed this election very, very closely, hoping not to see a replay of the 2000 Bush-Gore debacle, which set us back a decade in climate response. But sure enough, my hopes were dashed. I followed Nate Silver, who runs a website called 538.com, who was convinced that Clinton was going to take the presidency. And at the beginning of the final day, he agreed with this New York Times poll that she had an 80% chance. But as the day progressed, we all know what happened. And many of us were let down, some maybe not. Hopefully not too many in this audience. But so this very, very complicated world, and was it a complacency? which allowed the system to be nudged into something that that a lot of people did not expect. We also know that there were actors who'd found ways of nudging the system using various methods, and just a few 10,000s of votes were enough to shift the system. Very, very complex. But somebody with the insight was able to find those little levers. And so we end up where we are today. Hopefully not much longer. So, with that background, I just want to get back to this issue of chaos, because I think it's at the base of our lives, and certainly in terms of climate science, it explains why it's so difficult to predict the weather, and why there's so much uncertainty around the future climate, which many are using as an excuse to not do anything about it. But the chaos paradox is a paradox, because it says that if we were to know everything with perfect precision, we could predict the future. The future is deterministic. But in order to predict it, you have to know everything with absolute precision. If you have one measurement that's even slightly out by 0.0001%, your model will deviate from reality. And the guy that discovered this was Edward Lorenz, and it was discovered in climate science. And he developed a model, a simple model of climate, which had a few interacting factors, very simple relationships with them. And he ran the model on a computer. I think it was at MIT. And one night, running these simulations, he stopped a simulation. He started a simulation running, and he wanted to repeat it, but he didn't have the time to enter all the parameters perfectly. So he rounded some of them off and ran the model again. Came back the next morning, and the model was doing something completely different. And he was quite astonished. So he tried it again, and he figured out that if he just changed the initial conditions very, very slightly, the model would deviate. And that ultimately then came up with the realization that he couldn't really predict the weather beyond anything more than a few days. And that's why, with the projection of the Dorian path, the US kept on having to fly these flights to get more data and update the model, to keep on nudging it, to keep it in line with reality. Otherwise, it would have ended up over Alabama. That's the story that keeps on giving, man. It's not over. But I want to illustrate this here with a pretty little graph that came out of work like Ed Lorenz's, showing two versions of the same model, one run with slightly different initial conditions. And this is a value of the parameter x, evolving over time. And as you can see, with a very, very slight difference, the red curve starts to deviate from the black curve. And you end up with a very different future. And it's been called the butterfly effect. And I'll explain to you why that's a terrible term. Because it's come up with a complete misunderstanding of this issue. But to make sense out of that, what Lorenz did, and colleagues have done since then, is to plot the x value at time 1 against the x value at a subsequent time. And this at least gives us some hope that we can predict climate if we can't predict weather, and I'll explain why. So if you plot your x value against the next value every time you update it, you keep plotting x against x plus 1, you end up with this extraordinary, beautiful pattern, which is called a strange attractor. It's marvelous what these scientists come up with. This is a strange attractor, and it tells you that this system will never deviate out of these bounds. But every single dot here is unique. You will never get the same climate twice in a row. So when you look at a set of clouds, know that you will never see that cloud formation ever again. It's unique. It's a one-off. This is a characteristic of climate. And if you were to zoom in on this figure, you would see those dots resolve into more and more dots. They never fall one on top of the other. The climate never repeats itself. And that's the basis of what's called a fractal. So, but it tells us that although we can't predict the weather precisely, we can say something about the climate, because this is a climate system, and this is the weather within that climate system. So the idea that deterministic chaos prevents us from predicting climate is wrong. We can talk about climate, we just can't predict the weather particularly well. And that led to this whole idea of the butterfly effect. And the idea is that because of this high sensitivity to initial conditions, you can equate this to a butterfly flapping its wings. This tiny difference. And then the idea is that a butterfly flapping its wings in the Amazon can cause a tornado in Alabama. Who knows? It's wrong. That's the wrong interpretation of this pattern. Butterflies flapping their wings can't cause storms. All they can do is change very, very slightly the evolution of the system. So the butterfly effect, please don't misunderstand it. And it's a lovely name, and you can see how it grabs the public consciousness and misleads us. And this is a problem of language use. These evocative terms, the scientists love them. Strange attractors and butterfly effects. But they confuse people. Okay, I'm going to... how's my time, Ilse? I didn't know it when I started, actually. I'm doing okay time-wise. Okay, all right. Oh, good. No, that's fine. I'm just about there, to be honest. All right. This is a very experimental part of my talk. I've never spoken about this before. But I wanted to illustrate this issue of that we face in communicating science of expectation bias. And this is, I mentioned that you can show people graphs of the most horrendous phase shifts and changes and say that we're heading into a crisis, and they will deny it. They will find a way of denying it, because their whole being is expecting something different. They cannot deal with your idea. And part of this is this issue of expectation bias, that you're preconditioned by a whole range of things to expect something, and you will not see something different. But because you're in the Western Cape of South Africa, and you're in an amazing part of the world with an incredible history that is poorly known, I want to use an example from the Cederberg Mountains, a couple of hours north of here. For any of you who have some time to get up there, you'll never forget it. It's an extraordinary area to go to. This slide is taken in the Cederberg Mountains. These are amazing granite and sandstone massif, and it used to be occupied before Europeans arrived, and certainly for many thousands of years before, by the sand culture. And they left behind an incredible legacy of art on the walls of people call them caves. They're not deep caves, they're just cliff overhangs that the sand used to use for shelter. And these have been dated now to maybe 5,000 years old. These are ancient pieces of art. And I'm creating an expectation bias in you by describing this. 5,000 years ago, these were painted, and they used, so this is a late Stone Age culture, they used a mixture of powderized or powdered rock, red rock, mixed with animal fat and presumably some other substances. And when painted onto these sandstone surfaces, this really seeps into the rock. It stains the rock so powerfully that these images have lasted for millennia. It's quite an extraordinary thing to see. And you can go to a trail like the Sevilla Trail, and I strongly recommend it, and see these images. But how do you translate them? Because they obviously, the people who made these images are saying something. And it's so frustrating because we want to understand what they're saying. And they're very divergent interpretations of what they're saying. And it's very hard because we don't really have a direct link back to these people. And there are literal interpretations, so that this is a narrative. These are people telling stories about elephants, maybe give them a hard time. We don't know about eland, various other antelope, about shamanic figures, this narrative view. And then there's a very different view that says this is all about the spirit world. And these figures are telling us about the eland, which was a very powerful figure in sand culture. And because water was such a limiting resource, the sand would have rain dances. And rain was seen as an animal. It was conceptualized as an animal. And they would do a dance in which they would simulate capturing an animal like an eland and then kill it. And its blood would be rain. They'd be trying to get rain to fall. So very, very opposite interpretations of what these figures mean. It's very, very difficult to get to the bottom of all this. But I want to come back to this figure. So there's all this art out there, thousands of years old, and I think that there's a message here that we haven't seen yet. And as linguists and as translators, I wonder if you can see it and translate it. It does. It is staring you in the face. I wonder if anybody wants to suggest what this hidden message is. I'll give you a little hint. It's given that this figure may be several thousand years old. It's anachronistic. It's shockingly anachronistic. It's out of time. And but because I've built up an expectation bias in you, it's going to be very hard for you to see it. I'm going to relieve you of your suffering. An umbrella. Good try. You must be a Brit. You're getting pretty close. You're getting very close. Oh, where's my... The arc of the bow is a perfect circle. And that's astonishing. It is truly mind-blowing that this is out there. And nobody talks about it. But further than that, I need to point this thing to get the next story to come on. To the back, to the side. It used to be working. There we go. Can you see the two? Those two lines are dead straight. And they're virtually the same length. And that diagonal, whoops, I didn't want to go there. I'm scared to press it another time. Come on. Who's manning the computer? Or personing the computer? Oh gosh. Here we go. Yes, back under control. That line would have lined up with the arrow, which would have been done in white, which is the one pigment that washed away. But that virtually bisects these two angles. So what you're looking at here is a pre-Euclidean figure. A couple of thousand years before the Greeks invented this. And it's astonishing, but it's very, very difficult to see because it's a late Stone Age figure, and your expectation bias would prevent you from seeing it. I've presented this to people who study this, and I've now run into cognitive dissonance because they refuse to accept that this is going on. And this continues to today. We don't know how on earth this could have been done. But clearly, to make a figure like this, you have to understand conceptually what you're doing. You have to, because no bow bends in a perfect circle. This is a model. This is a conceptualization of how a bow bends. And somebody had the insight to draw this figure. It's interesting as well that this is one of the very few figures that is practiced, rubbed out, and redone. So there's a version of this up here which has kind of been rubbed out, and it's awkward. You can see it doesn't work. And it's almost as if the artist had to try again and get it perfect. But you must admit, it's a very arresting and amazing figure. And I hope it will stimulate at least some of you to get up into the Cederberg and go and look at these extraordinary images and enjoy what we have here. So, it's the first time I've shared this, and I hope the excuse is this expectation bias thing, but it's very interesting in its own right. But clearly, we have to think about the way these people thought about the world. Clearly, somebody had enough time and to sit down and really figure this all out, and then put it on this rock with such exquisite accuracy and precision. It's completely changed my view of what's going on. So I want to end with, and I'm sorry I spoiled the surprise. I want to end with the thought that what we need to do in climate science, and hopefully with the help of translators and people like you, linguists, is to talk about the message and not the noise. It would be great if you could help us. Thanks very much. Anybody wants to have a go at me about anything? There should be a roving mic. Or you can shout us, no problem. Wouldn't be the first time being shouted at. Yes, I see a hand.
I have a question for you concerning the relationship between nature and culture society. So, with complexity, we need long-term modeling to get closer to the truth. Do you think that holds for social dynamics too? And would these the practice hold for social dynamics?
Well, it's quite possible that they do. What's at the heart of the paradox is that these attractors are underpinned by very simple relationships, very simple cause and effect relationships. All you need is for a relationship to be nonlinear. In other words, for there to be a response to a driver that goes up and then comes back down again. You know, something like voter fatigue, or fatigue at being exposed to a candidate, let's say. You know, Elizabeth Warren. We love her. Oh, now we hate her. We've seen her too much. Something like that. So once you have those sorts of curves, you can generate these unpredictable, well, predictable but very difficult to model relationships. So the way that cities end up, for example, very similar cities close by can end up in very different states, and it's confusing. Why should these cities be so different? They're so close to each other. They have the same similar hinterland, similar people, but they end up in very different states. And it can be these small differences in initial conditions that drive things. But I think another thing with social issues is the importance of individuals. And that makes societies so extremely difficult to predict. You know, an individual comes along who is unique and drives things in a different direction. So Greta Thunberg is a nice example. We don't know where this goes, but a new person emerges, and because we focus, we kind of we idolize individuals, and that can really shift society in different directions as well. So my answer to your question is society is enormously difficult to model, and these curveballs like particular individuals can really throw things off. But even in economic systems, which we pay economists millions a year to model, they didn't get the crash of 2007-8 right anyway. So I don't know why we pay them. Yeah, it's a very, and I mean, I was really interested reading through the kind of work that you're discussing to try to see how you're starting to grapple with these sorts of issues. Maybe you'll find, like the climate scientists did, that it's inherently unpredictable, but maybe you can predict the general state, but not the specific state. I don't know. That would be a really useful step forward if you could do that. Yes.
Thanks for your talk. It's nice to have people coming out from the outside and getting new perspectives. So maybe I should preface my haphazard question by saying that my current research focuses on citizen science and translation. And you were asking, how do we communicate these complex climate messages to the masses? And my question is, do you think that citizen science and social media can play a role, and if so, what role in communicating this complexity or demystifying this complexity to the masses?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think it's very insightful. I have been involved with a citizen science project on birds, which has been very effective actually in communicating the climate change issue, because we've tapped into a citizen science group that collected data on bird presences in the Sorry? It's called SABAP, the South African Bird Atlas Program. People who collected data in the 1980s and are now recollecting the same areas. And so now we can start to see, based on their work, which bird species have changed, which ones have gone up, which ones have gone down. And that's been an incredibly valuable vehicle for communicating, starting to understand the drivers, the complexity of it. And then you have all these ambassadors who involved and who are able to take the message further. So I think yes. I think undoubtedly it's a really, really good way to move forward. Well-trained, reasonably well-trained citizen scientists can be enormously effective. We have seen that. Yeah. So it's a lovely way to do it.
Oh yes, I'm a linguist, not a climate scientist, so this might seem like a really naive question. You said, I think, we can't predict weather, but we can predict the general picture, we can predict climate. Presumably you do that within a margin. So I wanted to know, what's the margin? So what counts as getting a prediction right, and what counts as getting a prediction wrong? What's the margin of error that you allow yourself to say, I've got that prediction right?
Good question. I don't think we're that tough on ourselves, actually. I think, the modelers inherently know that their models do not get it right, but they're either useful or not useful. But your question is, how do we know how useful? And there are various metrics which are used to see how the model performs. And one really nice example was after the Pinatubo eruption in 1991, which released a large amount of sulfate aerosols into the atmosphere, which cool the climate. Volcanoes cool the climate if there are few enough of them, few of them. And the climate modelers ran their models to predict how much it should cool, given the Pinatubo eruption. And they predicted roughly 0.5 degree at the hemispherical scale, and they got it right. They were within a few points of a degree of 0.5 degree. And the right sort of time frame, so the temperature came down and went up again. Similarly, after 9/11, when the world's air fleet was grounded, the temperature went up a few points of a degree, and that was because aeroplanes create this haze, this contrail haze, which reflects light back into space. So once the world's fleet was grounded, climate scientists said, well, it was going to warm up, and sure enough, it did. So they use tests like that, but I think they're not too tough on themselves. You've touched a sore point. Certainly the ecologists are useless. You get it mildly right, we get excited. Yes.
Thank you very much for your talk. I was listening to you with a lot of interest, and you were talking about communicating science to the community. But I would like to know, and I know that maybe it is our side to give some answers, but how do you communicate with the stakeholders? And just now when you gave Greta Thunberg's example, I've been following the student climate strikes quite closely because, my daughter is very engaged. And so the kids have this very strong collective cause, which gives hope to us all. But on the other hand, there are the parties who want to make their stake, and we have ecological parties, we have leftist parties, and we have the liberal parties, and we have green capitalism, for instance. And so if you were to communicate with stakeholders, what is the message that you'd like us to translate to stakeholders? So that's the question.
Firstly, it's never too late. So this message that we've only got 12 years left is, it's good to have deadlines, but what happens when you get to 12 years? So it's never too late. It's the climate is changing, but the more action we take, the more we can prevent it from changing too much, or changing a lot. So that's number one, because you have, and it's true, and it does give hope. So every ounce of effort has a reward. But I think also, we shouldn't turn kids into zealots. So my son at age 8 or 9 was sitting in the back of my car. We were driving somewhere, and he said, "So Dad, how do I know who to believe on climate change?" And I was driving along. I said, "Well, you can always, what you do is you ask if the person has vested interests. So if somebody works for an oil company and you ask them about climate change, they tell you it's not important, well, then you've got to question that." He said, "Yeah, but Dad, you get paid a salary for talking about climate change." And I was like, good boy, yes. So yeah, I think we once you ingrain a single message or too few messages into kids, you're actually removing the ability for them to think creatively. So give hope on a correct factual basis, but also allow some creativity. I think that's really, really important. Who knows who's going to figure out how to get us out of this bind? It's a really interesting question, though. Thank you. We could go on all night. Nobody asked a question about Donald Trump. Cool. Thanks very much. Ooh. Wow. Very special. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Something special from Paul, our neighboring town. The only chaos paradox that I've been dealing with in translation studies is a PhD student, who dealt with actor network theory and an ethnographical method. And the diagrams and organograms that she drew almost look like that one that you had on. Very, very complex. So thanks for your talk.
Great pleasure.
Much food for thought.